What if the reality you're experiencing isn't exactly real? Have you ever had the feeling that something was wrong, even when everything seemed normal around you? Nothing concrete out of place, no visible threat, no logical explanation. And yet, that tightness in your chest, that unease that's hard to explain, as if your brain were warning you about something you can't see. If this has ever happened to you, stay with me because what you're about to discover might surprise you. Imagine a simple situation. You're at home on an ordinary day, and suddenly a strange feeling of unease arises. Your heart races slightly, your thoughts begin to race, and an idea keeps popping up. Something's wrong. But when you look around, everything is exactly as it always has been. No real danger, no immediate problem. Yet, your body reacts as if there were an invisible threat. Have you ever experienced this? What many people don't realize is that, in these moments, the brain isn't just reacting to emotions. It can literally be reinterpreting reality. Anxiety isn't limited to generating worry or nervousness. In more intense or prolonged states, it can alter how the brain perceives the world, memories, and even the body itself. Sensations, thoughts, and interpretations begin to take on a weight that seems absolutely real, even when they aren't. And that's where things get really interesting. The human brain doesn't work like a camera that faithfully records everything. It works like an editor. It selects, interprets, fills in gaps, and constructs narratives all the time. Most of the time, this process happens in a balanced way. But when anxiety enters the scene, this internal editor starts working in a distorted way. Small signs take on exaggerated meanings. Common thoughts begin to sound like urgent warnings. Intense emotions begin to seem like irrefutable proof that something bad is about to happen. Perhaps you've already noticed this in yourself. Thoughts that arise out of nowhere, negative scenarios that seem inevitable, memories of the past that return laden with guilt or fear, or even that strange feeling that reality is repetitive, strange, or slightly out of sync. All of this may be your anxious brain trying to protect you, but doing so in the wrong way. And the most curious thing is that, when anxiety is active, the brain tends to trust emotion more than facts. If something seems real, it treats it as real. If something sounds threatening, it reacts as if it were. It doesn't matter if logic says otherwise. Emotional perception takes over, and reality begins to be rewritten from the inside out. Perhaps you're thinking now, but if it seems so real, how can it not be? That's exactly the trap. The brain is extremely good at creating convincing experiences. It doesn't need external proof to generate intense internal sensations. And the more anxiety feeds on these interpretations, the harder it becomes to separate perception from fact. Stay with me until the end of this video because understanding this mechanism completely changes the way you see your own thoughts, your feelings, and even your fears. What seems like a sign that something is wrong may actually be a temporary misinterpretation by the brain trying to anticipate dangers that don't exist. Now, to understand how anxiety can do something so powerful, to the point of rewriting the reality you experience, we need to take a closer look at what actually happens inside the brain when it enters a state of constant alert. And that's exactly what we're going to explore next. And while you listen to all this, perhaps some memory, feeling, or thought has already surfaced within you. Maybe you recognized yourself in one of those moments when the body reacts before logic, or in situations where the mind creates such compelling stories that they seem impossible to ignore. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far, or an experience you've had that you could never quite explain. Sometimes, putting it into words helps not only you, but also other people who are going through the exact same thing and feel alone. If this content is helping you better understand what's happening inside your own mind, liking this video is a simple way to show that this kind of conversation needs to continue here. Each like signals that talking about anxiety, perception, and the brain in a clear and human way really matters. This allows this message to reach more people who may be experiencing these feelings right now, without knowing what's happening. Subscribing to the channel is also a way to walk this path together. Here, the idea is not just to explain strange brain phenomena, but to create a space where scientific curiosity, self-knowledge, and empathy meet. When you subscribe, you show that you want to continue exploring these mysteries of the human mind with me, video after video, deepening this understanding more and more. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and gain strength. It's not just about numbers, it's about building a community of people who want to better understand their own brains, without fear and without judgment. And now that you understand how anxiety begins to distort signals and sensations, it's time to delve even deeper into what really happens inside the brain when it enters this constant state of alert. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because to understand how anxiety manages to rewrite reality, it's necessary to first demystify what it really is within the brain. There's a very common idea that anxiety is just excessive worry, lack of emotional control, or even mental weakness. But this view couldn't be further from the truth. Anxiety, in its origin, is a sophisticated biological mechanism created to protect you. It's part of the same system that ensured the survival of the human species for thousands of years. The human brain is wired to detect dangers even before they become apparent. In hostile environments, this ability to anticipate threats made all the difference between life and death. The problem begins when this warning system, which should only be triggered in real-life risk situations, starts to function as the default. It's like an extremely sensitive alarm that goes off not only when there's a fire, but also when someone lights a match. When the brain enters a state of constant alert, it prioritizes survival above all else. This means that areas responsible for rational analysis, deep reflection, and balanced decision-making give way to more primitive regions focused on quick reaction. In this state, the brain doesn't ask if something is truly dangerous. It assumes it's better to react now and question later. This is a little-known aspect of anxiety. It doesn't seek objective truth, it seeks protection. And that's exactly where the distortion begins. The anxious brain starts interpreting neutral signals as threatening. A random thought becomes a serious warning. A common physical sensation takes on an alarming meaning. Silence transforms into rejection. A small uncertainty expands and becomes an entire catastrophic scenario. None of this happens because the person is weak, dramatic, or incapable of dealing with reality. It happens because the brain is operating under a different logic, focused exclusively on avoiding risks. In this process, the brain begins to fill in gaps. It hates emptiness, doubt, and uncertainty. So, when clear information is lacking, it creates answers. Not always correct answers, but quick answers. And the more anxiety there is, the more these answers are influenced by past experiences, old fears, and intense emotions. It's as if the brain were saying, "I've seen something similar before, so I know how this ends," even when that conclusion doesn't correspond to the facts. This explains why, in states of anxiety, the perception of reality changes so much. The world seems more threatening, the future seems more closed off, and even the past can be reinterpreted through negative lenses. Neutral memories gain greater emotional weight. Simple decisions seem laden with enormous consequences. The mindset silently shifts, and the person begins to live in a state of constant vigilance, as if something were about to happen at any moment. Another important point is that the anxious brain confuses emotional intensity with truthfulness. If something provokes fear, anguish, or tension, the brain understands this as a sign that it is real and important. The emotion becomes proof. And the more intense the emotion, the more true the situation seems. This is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to think positively or relax when anxiety is active. It's not a lack of willpower. It's the brain prioritizing internal signals instead of external facts. This mechanism also affects how the body is perceived. Common sensations such as a faster heartbeat, shortness of breath, or a slight tightness in the chest, begin to be interpreted as something wrong. The body becomes just another element in the narrative of danger that the brain is constructing. And so, little by little, external reality is replaced by an internal reality shaped by the state of alert. The impact of this on someone's personal journey is profound. Anxiety doesn't just change how a person feels. It changes how a person thinks, interprets, decides, and reacts. It influences choices, relationships, behaviors, and even how one's identity is constructed. Many people spend years believing the problem lies within themselves when, in reality, they are trapped in a brain mode that exaggerates threats and minimizes resources. Understanding this is transformative. Because when you realize that anxiety is a protective system functioning excessively, something changes in how you relate to your thoughts. They cease to be absolute truths and become signals from a brain clumsily trying to keep you safe. This understanding opens the way for a change in mindset, where observing what happens inside the mind becomes more important than fighting every thought that arises. And the more you understand these behind-the-scenes aspects, the clearer it becomes that anxiety doesn't create problems out of thin air. It reorganizes perception, highlights risks, hides possibilities, and constructs a hidden truth based on fear. It is at this point that reality begins to be rewritten, not because the world has changed, but because the filter through which it is interpreted has been altered. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a specific point where anxiety ceases to be merely an internal state and begins to directly interfere with how reality is perceived. This is the moment when the brain starts to edit your experiences. And this editing happens so subtly that, most of the time, you don't even realize it's occurring. Everything seems natural, logical, coherent. But, behind the scenes, something important has already changed. The human brain wasn't designed to register reality as it is. It doesn't function like a neutral camera that objectively records facts. It functions as an interpreter. What you see, feel, and understand about the world passes through emotional filters, past experiences, expectations, and, most importantly, the state your brain is in at that moment. When anxiety increases, this filter changes completely. In this state, the brain begins to operate with a clear priority, anticipating threats. It starts to look at the present as if it were always trying to predict a dangerous future. Small signs gain exaggerated prominence. Silences seem suspicious. Doubts seem like warnings. Common bodily sensations become indications of something wrong. The brain doesn't wait for proof. It creates scenarios. And these scenarios emerge with such a strong sense of reality that it's difficult to question them. This is where the most intriguing part of this journey begins. When clear information is lacking, the anxious brain automatically fills in the gaps. It hates uncertainty. The lack of answers is interpreted as risk. So, to protect itself, it constructs narratives. Internal stories that explain what is happening, even if these explanations are not true. The goal is not accuracy, it's security. And, for the brain, any explanation is better than none. These internal narratives begin to influence decisions, behaviors, and emotions. A quick conversation becomes a sign of rejection. A small mistake becomes proof of incompetence. An isolated thought becomes absolute truth. The brain starts connecting dots that shouldn't be connected, creating its own logic coherent within anxiety, but disconnected from objective reality. It's as if it were constantly revising the script of your life, adding tension, danger, and urgency where there was previously neutrality. What's most striking is that this process happens without asking permission. It doesn't depend on your conscious will. You don't choose to interpret things this way. The brain simply takes control because it believes it's helping. This is one of the great paradoxes of anxiety. It begins as a protective mechanism, but ends up becoming a source of distortion. The more it tries to protect, the more it alters perception. Over time, this constant editing of reality begins to have a profound impact on a person's mindset. The world begins to be perceived as a less predictable, less safe place. Decisions become more difficult because each choice seems fraught with hidden consequences. The mind enters a state of continuous vigilance, always trying to decipher signs, intentions, and dangers that may not even exist. At this point, the hidden truth begins to emerge. It's not the world that has changed, it's the way it's being interpreted. Anxiety doesn't create new facts, it changes the meaning of existing facts. And meaning is everything. It shapes emotions, directs behaviors, and defines how reality is felt. Two people can experience exactly the same situation, but the anxious brain will transform it into something completely different. This process also affects our relationship with time. The past is revisited with a more critical and heavy eye, as if each mistake were a confirmation of permanent failures. The future, in turn, is anticipated as a sequence of unresolved problems. The present almost disappears because the brain is always too busy trying to predict, avoid, or correct something. This is one of the most important revelations when we talk about anxiety. It hijacks the present moment. And the longer the brain remains in this editing mode, the harder it becomes to distinguish perception from reality. Thoughts begin to be treated as facts. Sensations begin to be treated as evidence. Emotions begin to be treated as reliable warnings. The line between what is internal and what is external begins to blur. Not because the person has lost their sense of reality, but because the brain is operating with different criteria. Understanding this mechanism is an essential step in transformation. Not because it makes anxiety disappear immediately, but because it changes the relationship with it. When you realize that the brain is interpreting and not registering, a space for observation emerges. A slight distancing. And this distancing is the beginning of a profound change in how thoughts and sensations are experienced. From this point on, it becomes increasingly clear that anxiety doesn't act alone. It works in conjunction with emotions, memories, and expectations, creating a complex and extremely compelling internal experience. And to understand why these interpretations gain so much emotional power, it's necessary to look at how the brain comes to trust what it feels more than what is verifiable. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when the brain begins to edit reality, it doesn't do so merely in an abstract or conceptual way. It manifests this editing through very specific, strange, and often frighteningly convincing sensations. These are experiences that seem real, intense, and undeniable to those who live them, but which, behind the scenes, are constructions of the brain itself operating under anxiety. And the most important thing to understand here is that none of this is uncommon. On the contrary, this is extremely common in states of anxiety. One of the most frequent signs of this process is catastrophic thinking. These thoughts arise automatically, quickly, and with a sense of urgency. A small doubt becomes a gigantic problem. A simple mistake transforms into a sequence of negative consequences that seem inevitable. The brain skips steps, ignores real probabilities, and constructs dramatic endings as if it were simply being logical. But, in reality, it is reacting to fear, not to facts. These thoughts don't appear because something bad is going to happen, but because the anxious brain believes it needs to prepare for the worst all the time. Another common experience is the feeling of reality repeating itself. Some people describe it as if they are reliving the same moment, as if the situations are too familiar, too predictable, or strangely similar to each other. This doesn't mean that time is repeating itself or that something supernatural is happening. It means that the brain, in a state of alert, begins to interpret patterns where they don't exist, trying to anticipate events even before they fully unfold. It's a constant attempt at control, even if it distorts the experience of the present. Memories also undergo this editing process. In states of anxiety, they can become confused, fragmented, or emotionally distorted. Past situations are revisited with a different weight, as if mistakes were greater than they actually were, or as if past choices permanently define who you are today. The brain selects specific parts of the memory and ignores the complete context, creating a more negative narrative consistent with the current emotional state. This is an important revelation. Memory is not a faithful archive. It is reconstructed every time it is accessed. False familiarity is another symptom that often generates a lot of unease. It's that strange feeling that you've experienced something before, been in a place, or known a situation that, rationally, you know is new. This experience can be deeply uncomfortable because it creates the impression that something is out of place. But, again, it's a misinterpretation. The anxious brain activates recognition signals without there being a real memory associated with them. It confuses sensation with memory, familiarity with truth. There is also a feeling of being disconnected from the environment, as if the world were slightly distant, strange, or less real. Sounds seem muffled, colors seem different, the body seems to function on autopilot. This experience often generates a lot of fear because the person feels they have lost control or that something serious is happening. However, this state is a common response of the brain when it is overloaded. It is a form of protection, an attempt to reduce stimuli in an already saturated system. It is not a sign of loss of sanity, nor of something irreversible. It is the brain trying to cope with excessive alertness. The central point here is to understand the impact of these experiences on the journey of those who live with anxiety. When these sensations arise, it's natural to question one's own perception, doubt oneself, and seek external answers for something that seems inexplicable. Many people enter a cycle of fear of their own fear, interpreting each new sensation as proof that something is wrong. And this only reinforces the state of alert, keeping the brain trapped in this mode of functioning. These symptoms seem real because, to the brain, they are real. The emotions, physical sensations, and thoughts are genuine. What is not real is the interpretation of threat associated with them. This difference is subtle but transformative. It completely changes the mindset with which these experiences are lived. Instead of fighting against each sensation or trying to forcibly eliminate them, space begins to emerge for observation, understanding, and choice. By understanding that these symptoms are constructs of an anxious brain, something internally reorganizes itself. The experience ceases to be a sentence and becomes a signal. A signal that the system is overloaded, hyperactive, trying to protect excessively. This change in perspective doesn't erase the feeling immediately, but it reduces the emotional impact it causes. And that, in itself, already alters the course of the experience. There's a hidden truth in this process that's rarely stated clearly. The brain doesn't go crazy under anxiety, it exaggerates. It amplifies signals, intensifies emotions, and accelerates interpretations. It does this because it believes this is the best way to ensure safety. And the more you understand these inner workings, the more you realize that transformation begins not in controlling the external world, but in changing how you relate to what happens inside your mind. From this point on, it becomes impossible not to notice that these symptoms don't appear in isolation. They are deeply linked to how the brain begins to trust what it feels more than what can be calmly analyzed. And it is precisely this excessive trust in emotion that sustains this entire, so convincing, internal construct. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. because there's a crucial point in the experience of anxiety that completely changes how reality is felt. The moment when the brain starts trusting emotions more than facts. And this doesn't happen by chance, nor due to a lack of intelligence or mental clarity. It happens because, in a state of alert, the brain reorganizes its priorities in a very specific way, and understanding this reveals important behind-the-scenes insights into how decisions, beliefs, and certainties are constructed. When anxiety is active, the brain enters a survival mode. In this mode, speed matters more than accuracy. The brain isn't interested in in-depth analysis, weighing possibilities, or calmly checking evidence. It wants quick answers. And the quickest way to respond to any situation is through emotion. Emotions are immediate signals. They don't require elaborate reasoning. They simply arise, intense, ready to guide a reaction. That's why strong emotion seems so convincing. When you feel fear, anguish, or tension, the brain interprets it as an indication of truth. It doesn't think, "I'm afraid, so maybe I'm interpreting this wrong." It thinks, "I'm afraid, therefore this is important." The emotion becomes a seal of authenticity. The more intense it is, the more certainty it carries. This is one of the most subtle and powerful mechanisms of anxiety. In this state, logic doesn't disappear, but it loses ground. It takes a back seat, muffled by emotional urgency. Rational arguments may emerge, but they seem weak, distant, or insufficient in the face of the force of what is felt. It's like trying to convince someone there's no danger while the alarm is already blaring loudly in their mind. Emotion dominates the narrative, and anything that doesn't confirm this narrative is ignored or minimized. This phenomenon explains why, during anxiety, negative thoughts seem so true. It's not because they are more realistic. It's because they are charged with emotion. A neutral thought doesn't attract attention. An alarming thought does. It activates physical sensations, accelerates the body, captures focus. The brain interprets this activation as proof that the thought deserves credence. And so, a hypothesis becomes a certainty, even without concrete evidence. The impact of this on mindset is profound. The person begins to live according to what they feel, not what they observe. External reality loses strength in the face of internal reality. Objective facts, such as "nothing serious is happening right now," are easily overridden by subjective feelings, such as "something is very wrong." And, for the anxious brain, what is felt now always seems more reliable than any logical explanation. There is a hidden truth in this process that is rarely perceived. The brain doesn't confuse emotion with truth by mistake, but strategically. In context of real danger, trusting emotion made sense. If something seemed threatening, it was better to react than to overanalyze. The problem is that this same mechanism continues to operate even when the danger is not real. The brain hasn't updated the context, it has only maintained the strategy. This dynamic also influences how decisions are made. Simple choices are avoided or postponed because any negative possibility takes on exaggerated weight. The brain projects future emotional consequences as if they were already accomplished facts. And the more intense the emotion associated with a decision, the more the brain believes that prediction is correct. This creates a silent cycle where decisions cease to be guided by external criteria and begin to be guided by internal sensations. Over time, this way of functioning can shape a person's entire journey. Relationships are interpreted through the lens of fear. New situations are avoided so as not to trigger uncomfortable emotions. The world becomes smaller, more predictable, less challenging. Not because the person doesn't want to grow, but because the brain associates emotional intensity with risk, and risk with something that needs to be avoided at all costs. The most curious thing is that, when anxiety decreases, many of these emotional certainties quickly lose their strength. What seemed obvious begins to seem exaggerated. What seemed impossible begins to seem manageable. This shows something fundamental. It wasn't reality that sustained those beliefs, it was the emotional state. The certainty came from intensity, not from veracity. This perception, in itself, already represents a great transformation in the way one relates to one's own thoughts. When someone begins to understand that emotion is not synonymous with truth, something internally reorganizes itself. Not because emotions cease to exist, but because they cease to occupy the place of absolute judges of reality. A small space emerges between feeling and believing. And this space is powerful. It allows one to observe, question, and choose with more awareness, even when discomfort is still present. This understanding doesn't eliminate anxiety immediately, but it completely changes the impact it has. The emotion continues to arise, but it loses some control over the internal narrative. The mind begins to recognize that feeling something intensely doesn't mean it's a fact. And this change in mindset opens the way to seeing how other areas of the brain contribute to reinforcing or softening this process. Because ultimately, emotions don't act in isolation. They interact with memories, expectations, and patterns learned over time. And to understand why certain emotions become so dominant and persistent, it's necessary to look at how the brain constructs continuity and meaning from past experiences. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is an even quieter and more powerful level of anxiety's influence, the way it rewrites the past and anticipates the future simultaneously. This is where many people strongly recognize themselves, even without ever having put it into words. Anxiety doesn't just live in the present. It travels through time. It revisits memories and projects scenarios with such conviction that it seems impossible not to believe them. When the brain is anxious, it doesn't access the past as a faithful record of what happened. It accesses the past as emotional raw material. Each memory passes through filters that amplify failures, risks, and pain. Neutral situations take on a negative tone. Old decisions begin to seem like obvious mistakes. Difficult moments become proof of inadequacy. The brain selects specific details, ignores context, and constructs a narrative consistent with the current emotional state. It's not a conscious lie. It's automatic editing. This explains why, in states of anxiety, a person may feel shame, guilt, or regret for events that, at another point in life, would not have the same weight. The brain revisits these memories as if trying to find patterns that confirm an internal warning. See? This has gone wrong before. This constant reinterpretation of the past creates a distorted sense of identity, as if the person were defined only by the moments in which they failed or suffered. At the same time, this same brain begins to anticipate the future with the same logic. It doesn't imagine possibilities, it simulates certainties. Negative scenarios are projected as inevitable. Small decisions seem to carry enormous consequences. Situations that haven't even happened yet are already accompanied by feelings of failure, rejection, or danger. The future ceases to be an open space and begins to be treated as something already decided, and decided unfavorably. This mechanism has a profound impact on mindset. The person begins to live trapped between a past that seems to prove they weren't enough and a future that seems to confirm that nothing will work out. The present loses importance. The now becomes just a point of passage between painful memories and frightening predictions. And, in this process, anxiety intensifies because the brain understands that it needs to remain vigilant all the time. There's a hidden truth here that's rarely noticed. The anxious brain isn't trying to hurt you by rewriting the past or anticipating the future. It's trying to predict risks to avoid pain. The problem is that, in doing so, it creates suffering before anything even happens. The emotional simulation becomes so intense that the body reacts as if the event were already real. And this further reinforces the feeling of certainty. These future simulations are especially compelling because they come loaded with emotion. The brain doesn't just say, "This could go wrong." It makes you feel as if it already has. Physical sensations, automatic thoughts, and mental images combine into a complete experience. And once again, emotional intensity is interpreted as proof. The stronger the feeling, the more real the scenario seems. This process directly influences decisions. Many choices are not made not because the person doesn't want to move forward, but because the brain has already presented the negative outcome as guaranteed. Avoidance begins to seem safer than trying. The personal journey narrows, not due to a lack of ability, but due to an excess of internal predictions. Anxiety creates a map of the future full of obstacles that do not yet exist. The distorted past and the anticipated future feed off each other. Each negative memory reinforces a pessimistic prediction. Each pessimistic prediction reinforces the negative reinterpretation of the past. The brain constructs a continuous narrative, where everything seems to point to the same place. And the more this narrative repeats itself, the more familiar it becomes. Familiarity, in this context, comes to be confused with truth. Realizing this is profoundly transformative. Not because it erases memories or eliminates future thoughts, but because it changes your relationship with them. When you understand that the brain is editing, not just remembering or predicting, a space for questioning emerges. A space where it's possible to observe the construction of these internal stories without automatically accepting them as facts. This understanding also brings an important revelation. Suffering lies not only in what has been experienced or in what might happen, but in the way the brain connects these points. It creates continuity where there could be a pause. It creates certainty where there could be possibility. It creates closure where there is still openness. From this point on, it becomes increasingly clear that anxiety is not just about fearing the present moment. It's about living trapped in edited versions of time. And to understand why the brain insists so much on maintaining this continuous line of meaning, even when it causes pain, it's necessary to look at an even deeper aspect of how the human mind works: the almost compulsive need to create coherence, even when that coherence doesn't correspond to reality. Write this down: I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after all this, an inevitable question arises in the mind of anyone living through these experiences: is this dangerous? Is something seriously wrong happening? Or is all this just a temporary malfunction of the brain? This doubt is natural, and answering it with balance is an essential part of this journey of understanding. When the brain begins to edit reality, revisiting the past in a distorted way and anticipating the future as if it were already decided, the internal sensation can be frightening. It's common for a person to think they are losing control, that something serious is about to happen, or that there is a deep-seated problem that will never go away. But the truth, in most cases, is very different from what anxiety makes it seem. In the vast majority of situations, this set of experiences is not dangerous. It does not indicate that the brain is broken, damaged, or permanently out of function. What is happening is an overactivated brain pattern. A protection system working beyond what is necessary, like software that enters emergency mode even when there is no real threat. This is uncomfortable, exhausting, and profoundly impacts quality of life, but it does not mean that something irreversible is happening. The human brain is plastic, adaptable, and profoundly influenced by context. Prolonged states of anxiety temporarily alter how information is processed, but these patterns can be modified. The transformation begins precisely when the person understands that they are not dealing with a definitive failure, but rather with an exaggerated functioning of mechanisms that exist to protect them. This understanding changes the mindset and reduces secondary fear, that fear of getting sick. It's important to differentiate between common anxiety, even when intense, and conditions that truly require specific professional attention. Common anxiety, while uncomfortable, tends to vary over time, be linked to context, stress, emotional overload, or life stages. It responds to changes in routine, emotional support, self-awareness, and, when necessary, appropriate follow-up. It doesn't progress continuously and inevitably into something more serious, as many people fear. On the other hand, there are situations where seeking professional help is essential, and recognizing this is not alarmism, it's responsibility. When symptoms are persistent, intense, and significantly interfere with daily functioning, work, relationships, or the ability to care for oneself, this warrants specialized attention. Similarly, when there is profound suffering, a constant feeling of loss of control, or thoughts that cause intense distress, professional support becomes an important ally on this journey. The difference here lies in perspective. Anxiety shouldn't be ignored, but it also shouldn't be automatically interpreted as something serious or dangerous. The balance lies in understanding that feeling anxiety isn't the same as being at risk. That experiencing distortions in perception doesn't mean losing your sanity. That the brain, even when it makes mistakes, is trying to protect you, albeit in a maladjusted way. There's a hidden truth that's rarely spoken clearly: the fear of being sick often amplifies the symptoms of anxiety itself. When a person believes that what they're feeling is a sign of something serious, their state of alert intensifies. The brain receives the message that there's even more danger, and the cycle reinforces itself. Understanding that, most of the time, this is a reversible pattern breaks this silent cycle. This understanding has a profound impact on how a person relates to their feelings. Instead of panicking with every new sensation, the possibility of observation arises. Instead of interpreting every thought as a threat, space for questioning emerges. This doesn't mean minimizing suffering, but putting it into perspective. Anxiety ceases to be a sentence and becomes a sign that something needs attention, adjustment, and care. When this change happens, something begins to reorganize internally. The mind gains a little more space. The body gradually reduces tension. Decisions are made with less fear and more awareness. Not because everything is resolved immediately, but because the internal narrative changes. The person stops fighting against their own brain and begins to understand it. And this is a crucial point in this journey: understanding that the brain can make mistakes without being broken, that it can exaggerate without being ill, that it can create frightening scenarios even when those scenarios are not real. This perception paves the way for a healthier relationship with thoughts, emotions, and sensations, reducing the impact that anxiety has on life as a whole. From this point on, it becomes increasingly clear that dealing with anxiety is not about eliminating thoughts or emotions, but about learning to recognize patterns, interpret signals more clearly, and reconstruct how reality is perceived. And to understand how this process can be eased and gradually transformed, it's necessary to look at what happens when a person begins to interact differently with these internal states. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after understanding how anxiety distorts perception, a natural need arises: how to break free from this automatic mode in which reality seems to be constantly being rewritten. And here it's important to be very honest. There are no magic shortcuts, nor a literal switch to turn everything off at once. What exists is something much more powerful and transformative: the gradual construction of awareness about one's own internal workings. The first step in this process is not to control thoughts, but to recognize them as part of a pattern. When anxiety is active, it tends to repeat the same mental scripts, the same accelerated interpretations, the same internal alerts. Realizing this changes everything. Instead of automatically entering the narrative, you become aware that it's happening. Not to fight it, but to see it. This awareness of the pattern creates a small distance between you and the thought, and this distance already reduces the emotional impact. When this observation begins to occur, something subtle transforms in the mindset. The person stops asking, "Why do I think this way?" and starts asking, "What is happening in my brain right now?" This change shifts the focus away from judgment and towards understanding. And understanding is always more regulatory than fighting. The brain responds better to clarity than to resistance. Another essential point in this process is to slow down automatic interpretations. Anxiety accelerates everything. Thoughts arise quickly, conclusions appear even before the facts are evaluated. Slowing down doesn't mean stopping thinking, but creating a gap between the stimulus and the interpretation. It is in this gap that the possibility of choice arises. The choice not to treat the first explanation that comes to mind as the only possible one. This interval may be small, almost imperceptible at first. Sometimes it's just a second where you realize you're completing something very quickly. But that second has a huge impact. It breaks the autopilot. It prevents the brain from continuing to operate at the same accelerated pace that sustains anxiety. Gradually, this space grows, and with it grows the feeling of internal control. There's a hidden truth in this process that many people ignore. Thoughts don't need to be fought to lose power. They need to be understood. When you try to eliminate a thought, the brain interprets this as a danger signal and tends to reinforce it. When you observe and question its nature, it begins to lose authority on its own. Transformation happens through a change in relationship, not through attempts at suppression. One of the most liberating insights on this path is understanding that not every thought is a fact. It seems obvious, but in practice this changes decisions, behaviors, and emotions. Thoughts are mental events. They arise, pass, and change constantly. In states of anxiety, the brain treats these events as absolute truths. Recognizing that a thought may be just a hypothesis, a simulation, or an emotional reflex drastically reduces its impact. As this understanding deepens, something begins to reorganize itself behind the scenes of the mind. The brain learns little by little that it doesn't need to react to everything urgently. That not every sensation requires an immediate response. That not every prediction needs to be taken seriously. This learning doesn't happen all at once, but it does happen. And each time it happens, the state of alertness decreases a little. This process generates real emotional relief. Not because the anxiety disappears, but because it ceases to control everything. The person begins to feel that they can get through an uncomfortable feeling without being dominated by it. This changes the internal experience. The fear of fear diminishes. Confidence in one's own ability to deal with thoughts and emotions increases. The journey ceases to be a constant struggle and becomes a process of adjustment. Another important impact of this change is on how decisions are made. When the brain is not completely dominated by anxiety, choices are no longer made solely to avoid discomfort. They begin to be made based on values, goals, and direction. Life begins to expand again even if anxiety is still present at times. This is real transformation built little by little. All of this reinforces a central idea. Turning off the reality rewriting mode is not about erasing emotions, but about changing the role they play. Emotions continue to exist, thoughts continue to arise, but they cease to be the sole criteria for interpreting the world. External reality begins to reclaim space. The present is once again experienced with greater presence. The mind begins to operate with more flexibility. And the more this flexibility grows, the clearer it becomes that the brain is capable of learning new pathways. It can break free from the pattern of constant alertness. It can reinterpret signals with more balance. It can gradually reconstruct a perception of reality more aligned with what is actually happening, and not just with what is felt at the moment. From here, an even deeper question begins to emerge, connecting all of this to a fundamental aspect of human functioning. If the brain is so good at creating stories to protect itself, why does it insist so much on maintaining a sense of continuity and coherence, even when it causes suffering? Understanding this need reveals much about how the mind constructs identity, meaning, and a sense of control throughout life. Write this down, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after exploring all these behind-the-scenes aspects of the anxious brain, a reflection begins to impose itself almost inevitably. Not everything that seems real is real. And this doesn't mean you're making things up, exaggerating, or deliberately deceiving yourself. It means that the human mind, when under pressure, amplifies shadows and transforms signs into certainties. Anxiety doesn't create monsters, it exaggerates shadows. And shadows, when viewed too closely, seem larger than they actually are. This perception completely changes how you relate to what you feel. Fear ceases to be absolute proof of danger and becomes an indication that the system is overly sensitive. Thoughts cease to be definitive sentences and begin to be understood as transient mental events. Bodily sensations cease to be interpreted as catastrophic warnings and become activation signals. This change does not eliminate discomfort immediately, but it profoundly alters the impact it has on your decisions and your journey. There is a silent transformation that occurs when you begin to realize that the perceived reality does not always correspond to the lived reality. The mind, accustomed to seeking coherence at any cost, begins to accept the idea that not everything needs to make sense all the time. That doubts are not threats. That uncertainties do not need to be filled with frightening narratives. This is a turning point in mindset because it reduces the constant need for control that sustains anxiety. When you understand that the brain interprets more than it registers, something reorganizes itself behind the scenes. You begin to observe your own thoughts with more curiosity and less fear. Instead of asking, "What if this is true?" the question, "What in my current state is making this seem so real?" begins to emerge. This simple shift shifts the focus from the threat to the functioning. And understanding the functioning is always more liberating than trying to overcome the content. The impact of this perception spreads to other areas of life. Relationships begin to be seen with more nuance. Decisions cease to be guided exclusively by the attempt to avoid discomfort. The future regains space as a possibility, not as a condemnation. The past loses some of the emotional weight it carried because it ceases to be used as constant proof of failure. Reality begins to be felt with more flexibility, even when anxiety still appears. This reflection also connects directly to something bigger: the way the brain constructs identity and continuity. The mind likes closed, coherent, predictable stories. Anxiety takes advantage of this to create linear narratives where everything seems to point to the worst-case scenario. But when you realize that these stories are interpretations, not facts, the chance arises to rewrite your relationship with them. Not by erasing what was experienced, but by changing the meaning attributed to each experience. This is a powerful revelation about perception and reality. The brain doesn't lie out of malice. It tries to protect. It tries to anticipate. It tries to maintain a sense of control. The problem is that, in this effort, it distorts. It amplifies. It accelerates. And the more you understand this process, the clearer it becomes that anxiety doesn't define who you are, nor does it determine what will happen. It's a state, not an identity. A way of functioning, not a sentence. This understanding connects with many other brain phenomena that we explore here. False memories, feelings of familiarity without recollection, decisions made before conscious awareness, perception shaped by emotion, predictions that seem like certainties. All of this is part of the same fascinating universe where the mind constructs reality from internal signals. And the more you observe these patterns, the more you realize that understanding the brain is fundamentally understanding yourself. This journey doesn't end here. It continues whenever you question an emotional certainty, whenever you slow down an automatic interpretation, whenever you choose to observe instead of reacting. It is in this space that reality begins to appear less threatening and more expansive. Not because the world has changed, but because the filter has changed. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." If you've made it this far, it's because this topic resonated with you on some level. So, subscribe to the channel to continue exploring these mysteries of the brain, perception, and the human mind with me in greater depth and clarity. This type of content only makes sense when we build it together, step by step. If you want, leave a comment saying this message was for me. Or, I'm with you until the end, just so I know you've followed this whole journey so far. And if this video made you look at your own thoughts in a different way, liking the video is a simple way to strengthen the connection we've created throughout this conversation. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic and delves even deeper into how the brain constructs reality. Click on it and continue watching it there.